Hello and welcome to this Silverstripe screencast. In this lesson, we'll introduce the concept of a controller action, which is a URL route that executes a function on a controller. So let's just go over what we're going to cover here. First, we'll talk about what controller actions are and how they're used. Then we'll go on to actually create a controller action to render a data object. And then we will present that data object as a page. Then we'll add some pseudo page behavior to make a data object sort of behave like a page. Now these are all really key concepts in Silverstripe, getting data objects to behave like pages. So they all kind of work together, and so let's get into it. So up until this point in our project, for the most part, every page has been on a single URL. And that URL points to a single controller, which renders a single layout template. However, if you think back to our lesson on forms, you may remember that we were able to extend the URL route of our controller in order to generate and render a form. We did this using a controller action. Forms are just one of many use cases for a controller action. Using controller actions is simple. All we're talking about is appending a URL part to an existing URL that matches the name of a publicly accessible method on the controller. So let's give it a try. So for this example, we're going to look at the regions page, and you'll see that it resolves to /regions off the base URL. Now let's try appending a new URL segment to that URL. So we'll go to regions/test, and not surprisingly, we get a 404. Now the reason why we get a 404 might surprise you. Let's take a look behind the scenes and see how Silverstripe is resolving this. Using the same URL, we'll append $debug_request to that URL, and we'll take a look at what's going on here. So we see testing $action /$ID /$other ID with test on regions page controller. So right out of the gate, you can see that Silverstripe actually did resolve our URL to regions page controller, which may come as a surprise since the URL for this page does not include /test. But what has happened is that the request handler has found a match for the URL and will assume that from this point forward, everything in the URL is a parameter being passed to the controller. By default, a controller gives you 3 extra parameters to pass beyond its base URL. We can see that in our debug output. So we have action, which immediately follows the URL. In this case, the action is test. We have ID, and that is an ID that the controller action may want to use. This value does not have to be numeric. It's arbitrary, and it's just named ID because that's a common use case. And then there's other ID, which is the same as ID. You just get 2 of them. So by no means are you limited to this signature of parameters. In future lessons, we'll be looking at creating custom URL routes, but by default, this is what you get, and it's often all you need. So let's look at the next line of debug output. We see rule $action /ID /other ID matched action handle action on regions page controller. So here we are. The request handler actually did match action /ID /other ID, and it's trying to resolve our action test. In the rest of the output, you can see that it fails to do that and it renders an error page. So why did it fail? Well, as we said before, the $action parameter should represent a publicly accessible method on the controller. We have no method called test right now. So let's add that method to our controller now. I'll just put a simple public function test, and we'll die it works just to see if we can get this working. Now we'll try accessing the URL regions/test, and we get action tests not allowed on regions page controller. So what's going on here? Well, if you recall from lesson 11 on forms, we're not quite done yet. We have to whitelist the test method as one that can be invoked through the URL. You can imagine the security risk that would be imposed by allowing all public methods on a controller to be invoked arbitrarily in the URL. We don't want to do that. By default, no methods are allowed to be called through controller actions. You need to specify a list of those that are accessible in a private static variable called allowed actions. And again, you should remember this from lesson 11 as we covered this when we talked about forms. So let's add this private static allowed actions, and we whitelist the method test. Now, just as a side note, allowed actions can actually get quite complex. You can map these methods to required permission levels and even set custom functions that evaluate whether they should be accessible at runtime, which is really useful for complex controllers. In this case, we just want to make sure that anyone can invoke the test action. So refresh the page with a flush. We changed a private static variable, and now it works. We get our die statement there. So let's actually use these controller actions to do something now. The most common use case for a controller action is to assign a URL to a data object that is nested in a page. And this is, in my opinion, one of the first milestones of becoming a skilled Silverstripe developer. Once you're able to do this, it sort of sets you apart from someone who's just getting by in Silverstripe to really understanding the framework. So we know that data objects are much more primitive than page objects. They contain none of the functionality for rendering a template. They have no link method, no meta tags, no controllers, etc. So in short, they're just not meant to be rendered as full pages. But that doesn't mean that you cannot assign them some of the properties necessary to do so. In fact, it often makes a lot of sense to do so. Let's keep the focus on our regions page. We have a list of region data objects that are related to the page via hasMany. We want to create a detail view for each one of the regions in our list. The user should be able to click on one of the regions and see more information. Now, this isn't an ideal use case for a data object on a page. These region objects could just as well be pages in the site tree. It often comes down to a judgment call for the developer, guided by what will work best for the content editor. In a future tutorial, we'll be looking at creating a detail page for our property data object, which, due to their volume, will be much more effective than managing them as pages. So that's a great use case for using data objects as a page. Regions, since we're only dealing with 4 of them, might not be the best use case. I could go either way. So let's start with the most fundamental requirement. Regions should be able to produce a distinct link for their detail page. So let's add a link method to each region. Now this is a convention on any object in Silverstripe. It should have a link method with a capital L if it does have its own page. So we'll have it invoke a controller action that we have not defined yet. So as you can see here, we get the regions page that owns the region via the hasMany has1 relationship. And we call its link method. So now this link method has gotten the link to the regions page itself. And we're going to add some extra URL segments that we want to append to the link. That's the first argument of the link method. It allows you to pass some extra URL parameters. So we specify an action of show and an ID that represents this region's ID. Now that we have the method, we'll apply it to the template. So let's go into regionspage.ss and change all those hash links to $link. So let's give it a try. We'll click on one of the regions, and the expected result is a 404, but you can see that we did go to a new route that we would hope would resolve to a detail page for the region. So fortunately, we know how to fix this 404. We can create a show method in the regions page controller, and we can whitelist it in allowed actions. So here's my show method. We're not doing anything new here other than ensuring that the show method gets its SS_HTTP request argument. We'll need that object for getting the ID. Now, if you're wondering about the SS underscore in front of HTTP request, that's just because of a namespace conflict with the HTTP request class that is natively supported by PHP, so we use SS underscore when there are conflicts. So now that we have a skeleton of how this is going to work, we'll build out the show method and fetch and return the region being requested. So this should be pretty intuitive, but let's walk through it. We get the region by the ID contained in the ID request parameter. Now remember, we have action, ID, other ID. So ID is referring to that second part after show. Now if that parameter is null, we don't have to worry. The byID method fails gracefully. So that's why I'm not checking to see if it exists or not. Now if a region doesn't exist, we return a 404. Every controller has this HTTP error method, which is really useful. And lastly, we're going to return an array of new variables to send to the template. The region variable will represent the region that we're dealing with. So now that we have that new variable being sent to the template, we're going to actually use it and render a data object as a page. Now, as we saw in the debug output of our request handler, the action parameter maps to a method called handleAction on our controller. While our action method itself is designed to do everything it needs to, the handleAction method that invokes our method is somewhat opinionated, and specifically it automatically selects a template for us unless we declare otherwise. A controller action will try to render a template following the naming convention pagetype underscore action name.ss. So in our case, that gives us regionspage underscore show.ss. Let's create that template. So we're just going to copy the layout page.ss to regionspage show.ss, so we have something to start with. And we'll remove the div class main block, and in its place we'll render some content from the region object. Now this is a great opportunity to use the with block. So I'll open up the with block, and I'm just going to add the photo and the description, and then I'll close out the with block. Now we added a new template, so we do need to flush the cache. So let's do that, and we'll try clicking on a region, and we'll see that we do get a detail page. Now there's one thing that's a bit odd right now, and that's that the description field is presented exactly the same way on the list view as it is on the detail view. So there's not much point in clicking on this region. So let's update the region data object to store its description as an HTML text so that it could conceivably be much longer. We'll run dev build, and we also need to update that CMS field for description, so we'll just go in there and change that to an HTML editor field. So now on regionspage.ss, we'll just use description.firstParagraph. And don't forget to remove the p tags around that, because first paragraph is going to get you those p tags. It's an HTML field. Now there's still a few things missing for making this data object really feel like a page. The most glaring problem is that the title of the page is still regions, rather than the more appropriate title of the region we're looking at. Normally we'd find the title variable in our template and simply change it to region.title, but that variable doesn't live in regionspage show. It actually lives further upstream in the banner include. So we'll need to override it in the controller. Remember that array we passed to the template containing our custom variable region? Well, we can use that to overload properties in the template that would normally infer from the model. So let's add the title to that list. Now that I've specified the title in the array, this becomes the source of truth. Falling back on the model to find that property is the default behavior, but what we pass here is actually the customized version. So we'll refresh the page and we'll see that we do get a new title. So we're not quite there yet. The new title is showing on the page itself, but it's not affecting the title tag, and that's because back in lesson 3, we handed over control of the title tag to our magic method $meta tags. Now, back in that lesson, we discussed the option of passing it a parameter of false to suppress the title tag in meta tags. So let's do that so we can customize our title tag. So I'll change that to false, and then I will just do title one ring rentals, and then we'll do the title of the page. We'll refresh the page and we see that the title tag is now working. Another enhancement we can make is the perception of a hierarchy. We can use our sub-navigation section to display all the peer regions with some state applied to the current one. So I'll go into that category subnav, and I'll loop through all the regions. Now remember that even though all the content on this page is really driven by that region object, we're still in the scope of regions page controller. So when we step into loop regions, we're using that has many relation that we also use in list view. Same controller, just a different template. So I'll refresh the page and we see that the regions are now all displaying, but we're still missing that current state for our region. And that's because the method linking mode doesn't exist on DataObject. So we need to write our own. So here's our linking mode method. Now remember, we're in the context of a simple data object here, so we don't have any awareness of the request. Controller cur, which is short for current. Current is a key word in PHP, so that's why it's shortened. This is a useful method that gets us the currently active controller. Off that object, we can get the request object that has been assigned to it and look for param ID, the same way we did in our show action. We're able to use that method param to look at ID. If the ID in the URL matches the region's ID, we return current, otherwise we return link. We don't have to worry about section for something this simple. We'll refresh the page and we see that we now have a current state for the region. That is all for this tutorial. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.